Head over to patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps and sign up for my free content page, where I'll be interacting with you, doing live streams, posting exclusive content, sending out newsletters, and dropping a major limited series podcast exclusively for Patreon members later this year. That's patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. On a cold night in February 1982, a maniac travels from Tennessee to Farwell, Michigan, with two things on his mind: retaliation and revenge. And what he has planned, the good people of this small town are unaware, will become one of the most gruesome, deadliest crimes in the state's history. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. Garfield Township, Michigan is way up in the northern part of the state, beyond Grand Rapids and Lansing. It sits almost directly in the middle of the state, with Great Lakes flanking the land to the east and west like two big lungs. Rock Road, in the town of Lake, runs straight as a pole. Lake Station Avenue on one side, Garfield Avenue on the other. On February 16th, 1982, sometime near about 6:30 p.m., 21-year-old Karen Ewell is driving along Rock Road with two young girls sitting in the back seat on their way into Farwell, the closest town, to buy pom-poms and then head to cheerleading practice. It's a cold day, and the snowpack on the ground is thick and hard and crusty. Up here, you kind of just get used to having snow all winter long. And so you are conditioned by habit to drive a bit slower and pay a little bit more attention to your surroundings. As Karen passes a white ranch-style farmhouse with paint chipping off the siding like flakes of confetti, she sees a man she does not recognize standing outside a neighbor's house next to a gray pickup truck. She's never seen him before. He looks preoccupied and nervous. But then, that's perhaps a judgment more than a fact, and so Karen takes a quick glance, notices him, doesn't really think much of it, and carries on to the store. The man has a full beard. He's kind of tall and a bit overweight. He doesn't look like he is doing anything in particular other than standing, but he does, however, appear to be waiting for someone. The house he stands in front of is owned by the Post family as part of what is their 57-acre pig farm. A large family with kids and nieces and nephews, the Posts are known in the small town as just regular farm folk. They keep to themselves, run their pig farm, some work other jobs. They celebrate birthdays and holidays, same as everyone else, and don't much cause a fuss with anyone. Running a farm is beyond a 24/7 job and requires everyone in the family to pitch in, and the Posts stick together in that regard. They work hard, keep out of other people's business, and have no trouble telling most anyone who asks how grateful they are for being able to live off the land and support themselves in such a beautiful part of the country. Garnetta is 24 years old in 1982, the daughter of Vaudrey Post, whose husband George, now Garnetta's stepfather, has run the family farm for most of his life, on top of working several other jobs. George has children of his own as well. After a bit of teenage turmoil among new family members meshing together, things settled down and they all learned to live and work together. When Garnetta was 15 in 1973, George had just happened to stumble upon Garnetta and a local boy having sex in the house, and George was beyond pissed. He and Garnetta were then at odds, before Garnetta accused her stepfather of doing things to her, which was ultimately viewed as a diversion from being caught, literally, with her pants down. So in other words, he catches her, she accuses him of stuff, and then they all work it out. All these allegations were later known to be false. Giving Garnetta another chance, George and Vaudrey decided Garnetta would get a job and begin working. Hard work built character. The Posts had lived that ideology their entire lives. So at 16, Garnetta began working as a waitress alongside her aunt at a local Greasy Spoon not far away from the farmhouse. You know these places. A local diner-like restaurant with bells on the door, and everyone is called by their first name when they walk in. During the summer of 1977, as Garnetta is working her shift at the restaurant, a stranger walks in. He seems a bit rough around the edges, garrulous, and even aggressive, but Garnetta takes a liking to the dude. After he leaves, she figures she'll never see him again, and she doesn't really much care for or even think about the guy. People pass through all the time. She isn't necessarily in the market for a man anyway. But no sooner had she forgotten about the guy, there he is, showing up regularly, giving Garnetta the eye, and asking her out. Hog auctioneer, the man says when Garnetta asks what he does for a living. Robert Lee, he adds. That's my name. Robert Lee Haggart. By then, Garnetta had a mobile home in nearby Loomis. Wasn't much, but it was hers, and she was taking care of herself. In a town of under 1,000 people, with not much work beyond the restaurant and the farms, Garnetta was doing okay. Her stepfather and mother were right. Hard work had given her purpose and built self-esteem. She was her own person. Not long after Robert Lee and Garnetta start dating, Garnetta finds out she's pregnant. She's just 20 years old and does not want a child. She's not ready. So Garnetta makes the choice on her own to get an abortion without consulting with Robert. Upset enough over the choice, she tells Robert one night that she'd gone and had it done. He explodes in anger. How dare she do something like that without telling him? Robert is an Army veteran and had spent some time in Vietnam as a sharpshooter. His version has always been that he was wounded within a few months and sent home not long after arriving in Southeast Asia. From there, he traveled around the States a bit before first settling in Tennessee and then finally making it up to Michigan. Personally, I think all of that is bullshit, but that's just me. Garnetta tells him it was her decision, but this doesn't sit well with Robert Haggart, and they decide splitting up is the best thing to do. By 1980, however, they are back together, and this time, Haggart winds up moving in with Garnetta. Within a year, they are married. Robert Haggart had a few things he loved more than anything else: ladies and booze. And he often hung around the area bars far too longer than he was welcome, many times being shut off and told to leave. Garnetta wasn't having any of it. The dude was a drunk and a womanizer, lazy, and, unfortunately, she hadn't realized it until after they were married. Probably because she was always working too damn hard to have time to think about anything else but making ends meet. What tips the marriage over the line and into divorce is when Robert starts hitting Garnetta. Then he writes a $17,000 rubber check for some livestock, which of course bounces, and he is now being investigated by law enforcement for larceny. She wants nothing to do with it. As investigators begin looking into Haggart's background, it seems he has been in some serious trouble already. When he was 23 years old, Robert Haggart was at a local American Legion hall and getting his drink on when he ran into a 14-year-old girl he somewhat knew. As he is leaving the bar that night, he asks her if she needs a ride home. Along the way, he pulls over, begins groping the girl and forcing himself on her, and is eventually charged. From then on, he is a convicted sex offender, and his crimes begin to pile up. From violent assaults, another sexual assault charge, to other crimes having to do with ducking out on paying his bills. So Robert Haggart is not the man Garnetta thought he was. Not even half the man. And once she realizes he's basically a shitbag, she decides to move out of the trailer and into the farmhouse with her mother and stepfather and initiate those divorce proceedings. By the time she files the paperwork, there is an arrest warrant out for Robert based on that bad check he wrote for the $17,000. But law enforcement cannot seem to find him. He stopped showing up for work, his employer tells police. In fact, Robert Haggart had hightailed it back to Tennessee, a place he is familiar with, while Garnetta, fed up with life in Michigan, wanting desperately to get away from Haggart, decides to also get the hell out of Dodge herself and head down to Florida to start over. It is now August, heading into September 1981. By February 1982, as that young woman I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Karen, is heading to cheerleading practice and drives by the Post's farmhouse and sees that man standing by a truck, Robert Haggart is said to be back in town to finalize his divorce, but also now standing in the Post's driveway by that truck, waiting for Garnetta to show up. I have to tell you, when I listen to a true crime podcast, what I am looking for is hosts qualified to talk about what it is they are actually talking about. It's pretty hard to find these days. My friends Alice and Brett from the Prosecutors podcast have the experience and knowledge to drill deep into the cases they cover with sensitivity, factual reporting, engaging storytelling, and the perfect amount of personal chit-chat. So I encourage you to check out The Prosecutors, a top-notch true crime podcast, wherever you get your favorite shows. You won't be disappointed. I'll be right back after a short break.
This season on Very Scary People, Christine Belford reports her 3 young daughters missing. She has no idea where they are, but she knows who took them. Her ex-husband has teamed up with her former in-laws to do whatever it takes to have total control of the girls, including stalking, harassment, and even murder. Listen to Very Scary People wherever you get your podcasts.
Garnetta's stepfather, George Post, with whom she had not had the best relationship with as a youngster, is 53 years old in 1982. Beyond working the farm, George Post is the father of 7 kids. He is also a local mail carrier, is on the local school board, and active in his local VFW as a commander. People in town like George. He gives a lot back to the community. On that Monday, February 15th, 1982, Robert Haggart had decided to head back to Michigan under the pretense of showing up for a scheduled divorce hearing. But that is not the real reason he travels from Tennessee to Farwell on a Greyhound bus and heads directly over to the Post's farmhouse the next day, February 16th. Garnetta is not at the house in Farwell at the time Haggart arrives. Most of her relatives, however, are gathering for a family reunion of sorts. They know that Garnetta is coming up from Florida because she has that court date, and so they wanted to throw a little barbecue, a little party. As everyone is in the house, with additional members of the family set to arrive, nobody hears Haggart as he walks up the gravelly driveway toward the house before heading into the basement through a hatchway. Looking around, he finds George's shotgun and also a small handgun. George must have heard something downstairs because he heads down into the basement to see what's going on. As George is walking down the stairs, Haggart shoots him. George's body is later found at the bottom of the stairs with a massive shotgun blast through the center of his chest. From there, Haggart heads upstairs. Garnetta's stepsister, Helen Gaffney, is there with her 4 children to celebrate Garnetta's return from Florida. Helen's father is also in the house. Haggart sees him next and shoots the old man, killing him instantly. Helen grabs her 4 kids and runs out the door screaming toward the truck she had driven over in. As Haggart follows, all of them make it to the truck and get inside. Not far behind, Haggart reloads, walks up to the truck, and unloads the shotgun before brandishing that handgun he had found and unloading that as well. Helen is killed as she covers her 4 kids with her body. 3 of the 4 children also die from gunshot wounds. The youngest, a year and 3 months old, is underneath what is a pile of bloody bodies and now covered in blood. Helen is considered a hero for saving the child's life by covering her completely. Haggart realizes at some point that Garnetta had not yet arrived. But there is now blood all around the truck, especially underneath. So Haggart gets to work covering the blood with snow, so when Garnetta pulls up, she doesn't see it. He then heads into the kitchen of the house to hide and wait. Soon, Garnetta and her mother, Vaudrey, pull up and park. Haggart sees them from the window and readies himself. As they walk in through the kitchen door, Haggart fires a blast from the shotgun without saying a word, killing Garnetta and her mother, who were found later with wounds to the chest. There's no account of what Haggart really does next, but we know he leaves, which is when Karen and the 2 young girls heading to cheerleading practice see him standing by that truck. At 6:30 p.m., George Post's daughter, Alice Russell, arrives at the house with her husband. The house is dark and eerily quiet, and there are 3 dogs outside barking, which is, of course, very unsettling. They are expecting a family gathering of kids and adults, but it seems like nobody is around. Alice and her husband walk into the kitchen, turn on the lights, and immediately see the bodies of Garnetta and her mother. The kitchen floor is covered in blood. Without thinking, they take off out of the house, run to a neighbor's, and explain what they had just seen. The neighbor grabs his weapon and heads over to the house, sees the dead bodies, and phones the local sheriff. When law enforcement arrive, they are overwhelmed by the amount of death inside and around the house. 7 bodies in total, with the 1 child found inside the truck out front underneath her mother, crying but alive. It is determined that Haggart took off in Vaudrey's white Buick. This as helicopters and state police are now scouring the area for the perpetrator of this crime. There's no question in anybody's mind about who did this. Several report seeing Haggart back in town earlier in the day, and others report how Garnetta and Haggart were at odds over the divorce and had a scheduled divorce proceeding pending. That night, the local paper headlines the scene at the Post farmhouse as the Rock Road Massacre, a mass murder of insurmountable proportions, the third deadliest mass murder in state history. Robert Haggart had shot his victims all in the chest, the medical examiner determines, with a 20-gauge shotgun and a .38 caliber handgun. I've spoken to law enforcement who have been on these types of mass murder scenes. It changes you. Images are implanted in your mind you can never get rid of. I've known investigators who have left the job after being called out to similar scenes. Their lives changed literally forever. They become reclusive and rarely speak to anyone. Haggart makes it back to Tennessee the following day, and yet there is a nationwide search underway for the guy. Haggart had a reputation for hitting Garnetta, and local law enforcement knew him well. The family had reported him to the local sheriff's office more than once for becoming violent with Garnetta. So it's not hard to put together that he had come back into town for that divorce hearing, but decided to instead initiate revenge on the woman who was divorcing him. Her family, he later says in not so many words, simply became collateral damage. Investigators locate a friend of Haggart's in Tennessee. He says he hasn't seen him for a few days. Haggart then calls that friend when he gets back into town. "I'm down south again," Haggart says. According to a newspaper report of the call, the friend hesitates but tells Haggart, "The police called and they are looking for you." Haggart says, "I heard about the killings. I cannot believe I'm a suspect." They hang up. Scared and skeptical of Haggart's story, his friend calls police right away. Within a day, Haggart is arrested in Haletown, Tennessee, while driving Vaudrey's white Buick. Searching the vehicle, they find a loaded pistol, and later, bloody clothing is discovered at the Haletown apartment where Haggart had been staying with a woman. That blood matches two of the victims, and the pistol is also tied to the mass murder as well. I don't think we talk enough about the effect mass murder has on communities and the broader public. The anxiety that people feel afterward. It's hard to fathom that individuals can walk into a school, church, movie theater, or in this case, a house, take out in a single event 4 or more people, which qualifies as mass murder. This type of crime sows fear into people and even a community. It's like this deep-seated dread surrounding just going about your average day-to-day routine. An emotional aftermath which can last generations. I live in Connecticut. No matter how long it's been, I drive by Sandy Hook, Newtown, even on the highway, and my mind goes immediately back to the day when Adam Lanza killed all of those children and teachers. The most common motive in these cases is, no surprise, revenge or retaliation. Some commit mass murder, as we know, for the attention, to become famous. Many of these shooters, research indicates, have a psychotic break from reality and hold grandiose perceived notions about the people they view as the tormentors. In the cases I have studied, and I am uncertain if it is present here in Haggart's case, there is some sort of mental illness involved. The fact that Robert Haggart did not kill himself afterwards or set off on some sort of suicide by cop showdown with police says something about his thinking. It does not sound like he had what is called a fatalistic view of the world, which is common in these mass murder cases. When Haggart was arrested, one report indicates that .38 caliber pistol he had with him was loaded and under his feet inside the vehicle he was stopped in. It wasn't until the cop who stopped him put the barrel of his shotgun to Haggart's ear did Haggart relent and throw up his hands. So Haggart planned on continuing to kill. I think we can assume that. Within a few days of his arrest, Haggart is extradited back to Michigan. He arrives just as 200 people from town are attending the wake for all the victims. Haggart pleads not guilty. Of course he does. He says he didn't do it. that the state is going to have to prove its case at trial. And we'll get into that portion of the case after a short break, including a twist in the life of Robert Haggart, discovered about 10 years ago. Be right back. You know, this show is not the place to get into a debate about mental illness versus guns and the polarizing issue that we all hear when mass murders take place and the discussion becomes public. It almost feels pointless to talk about anyway. We can never agree on anything in this country where mass murder is concerned, and nothing ever seems to get done. Am I wrong about that? On that note, I will add one thing. Perhaps we are not asking the right questions. Without the right questions, solutions cannot present themselves. I can also say that for all of my life, I have never been a gun guy, for or against, not for any particular reason. I just never became interested in having a weapon in my house. I didn't grow up around guns. Maybe that's why. I don't know. But I will say this. After producing and publishing my podcast about the murder of Boston police officer John O'Keefe and the trial of his girlfriend Karen Reed, I received several legitimate death threats, coupled with some of those same online lunatics doxing one of my houses, posting where I live, calling my kids, and just so much more online rhetoric, bullying, hatred, whatever you want to call it. So I found myself living alone with plenty of security, obviously, but without a second thought, I felt the need to become a gun owner, and I now have 3 inside the house. Part of this stemmed from me having to report these death threats to the FBI and my local PD and having conversations with them. It was time. My point with this is to say that oftentimes the answer to a problem, which we in this country view mass murder as a problem, is to perhaps take a look at it differently. Take a look at ourselves differently, the people we are, and maybe start by asking different questions. Let me read something. The Community Mental Health Journal says this, quote, enhancing timely and assertive community-based treatment for people with mental illnesses who are at risk of committing violent acts, either against others or themselves, does hold promise for more broadly reducing the number of victims of violence in the United States each year. Apologies for the cynical and sarcastic clapping track, but come on. Really? That statement sounds good on paper. But beyond saying what we already freaking know, what is the solution? What does a statement like that do for the families left behind by mass murder? Nothing. The American Journal of Public Health claims that, quote, we simply do not know precisely how often mental illness is involved as a risk factor for mass murder. Anecdotal reports indicate that some people who commit mass murder have had mental health problems. However, because nearly 50% of people in the general population will experience symptoms of a mental disorder at some point in their lifetimes, journalists often identify mental illness in the history of a violent perpetrator, even when there is no direct evidence of a link between mental illness and the person's violent act. That, to me, is so very telling. So what they're saying is we are misreporting a lot of the actual facts in these cases, which then, in turn, have a detrimental effect on how we later view and discuss them. Something to think about there. If you notice in this case, Robert Haggart used George Post's guns that he found in the house to kill everyone. So it's not as if Haggart is running around with weapons he obtained illegally, or even brought his own legally obtained weapons to the house. He used weapons the guy he killed had in the house for his own protection. An alternative question here might be this. Could this particular scumbag, Haggart, have been stopped? Could this mass murder have been avoided by punishing Haggart for the crimes he had committed before he killed an entire family? He had committed serious crimes, been found guilty, but he never did any serious time. Robert Haggart made the decision to kill his wife before a divorce hearing. Her family stood in his way, even children. When later asked about killing the kids, Haggart suggested, "Oh well, once I got going, I couldn't stop shooting." We do not understand mass murder, and perhaps never will. It is unlike serial murder, which we have a good, solid interpretation of. But look, enough of my little monologue about guns and mental illness and mass murder. And if you'd like to write to me and comment, please do so. But be kind. We can have an intellectual dialogue here about this. I can read your comments and talk about this more if you'd like. Haggart's defense during his trial consisted of him saying he went over to the house, found the bodies, got scared, and took off in Vaudrey's car. He had nothing to do with any of the murders. Yeah, okay, dude. You just happened to be there right after somebody else killed 7 people, including the woman who was divorcing you the following day. A woman you had beaten and treated poorly for years leading up to the murders. They have everything they need as far as evidence. The greatest fluke in the case, the prosecutor adds, was a guy dumpster diving by a Kentucky Fried Chicken who found Mrs. Post's purse in Tennessee, near where Haggart was living. The guy's guilty as hell. After 2 days of deliberations, a jury agrees, finds Haggart guilty, and convicts him of 6 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. Haggart was sentenced to life without parole and died in prison in 2003. In 2009, however, Midland County Sheriff Jerry Nielsen stood at a lectern and made an announcement, and Haggart's name came up once again. Doris Ann Arndt, a young woman from Midland County, Michigan, who had gone missing in 1977, 5 years before Haggart mass murdered an entire family, and whose body was found months later, was strangled to death by Haggart. Apparently, Haggart had confessed the murder to a man who then requested more information about the case from the sheriff's department. When the sheriff's department told him it was an open case and couldn't honor the request, the man told them what Haggart had said. So they tested Haggart's DNA against the DNA found at the Doris Ann Arndt crime scene, and it matched. So Robert Haggart was a murderer when Garnetta had first met him. That's it for this week. I want to thank Marcia, a listener, for sending this one in. It made me think about some things that are maybe uncomfortable, which can only be a good thing, right? One note before I go. I've added a new feature into the Crossing the Line feed, Shortcuts. These are shorter episodes of cases in addition to the weekly show. I'll release a shortcut on Fridays once or twice a month, and each of those 15 to 20-minute episodes will cover cases that don't necessarily fit into the longer Crossing the Line format for whatever reason. I'll be covering missing person and murder cases, but also crimes of a different nature. So check out those episodes, Shortcuts. They're perfect for a short walk with the dog, sitting with a cup of coffee, folding laundry, or walking on campus from one class to the next, whatever. Be safe. Be aware. Sources for this episode include People vs. Haggart, appeal documents. 7 family members murdered, bodies found in truck, house, Detroit Free Press, February 18, 1982. Ex-con husband in Michigan slangs. Petoskey News Review, February 19, 1982. Extradition waived by suspect. Lansing State Journal, February 20th, 1982. Massacre of 7 stuns Farwell. Lansing State Journal, February 18th, 1982. Small town in Michigan feels the dread that follows mass murder. The New York Times, February 19, 1982. Witness places Haggart at death scene. Lansing State Journal, September 17, 1982. DNA unravels murder 30 years later by Kelly Damoff, Midland Daily News, July 22, 2009. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinus, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Music by Epidemic Sound. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.